This is a book talk tutorial of one of my favorite books. It's called Monster by Walter Dean Myers. And I chose this book because it's a really good example of a more modern book that the students could really relate to. I think, well, when I read this book, and the thing is, I read this book more recently, uh, and when I read this book, one of the drawbacks of becoming an author and learning how to write stories is that it takes a lot more to really blow you away. Because it's like a magician watching another magician. You know the tricks and you know how they're doing it. So when I'm reading a book, oftentimes it takes a lot to really blow me away. Well, this book really blew me away. It is a fantastic story, written so well. And the funny thing, I wasn't really a fan of Walter Dean Myers before I read this book. His books are very geared towards the experiences of the African American teen. And sometimes they don't cross over very well in terms of wide appeal, but this one definitely does. I think it would create lots of conversations within the classroom, between all the kids, boys, girls, doesn't matter. They would all really enjoy the story. Now, the format of the story is really interesting because Mr. Myers, he decided to write it as a screenplay. And I thought it was a very curious choice. In some ways, it's like amazing because you actually read it like a movie. And I think because so many of his readers, young contemporary kids, they're so familiar with movie adaptations and movie technique that it was a brilliant choice. And so when you're reading it, he puts it. The whole format is exactly that of a screenplay. And yeah, it's a very interesting choice. And apparently, one of the reasons he did this, from the things I've read online, is that he said that a lot of the teens that he found that were being incarcerated, they often looked at their life in a very detached kind of a way, like like they were looking at their actions, all the things they had done over the course of their life, without really owning it, without seeing it as if somebody else was doing it, as if it was a movie, separate from themselves. So that's one of the reasons why he wrote it as a screenplay, and I thought it was really, really interesting choice of format. Um, Now, when it comes to literature, I think especially, I think the people who need to read this book almost the most are kids from white middle class backgrounds, because this story, it provides like a vicarious experience, and that's what really good literature does. Good literature provides a vicarious experience. You are reading about another person in another culture, in another situation that you might not necessarily get into. In fact, what they have found is that often kids who read about troubled teens, about even teen pregnancy and other issues like that, because they read about it vicariously, they actually don't necessarily go down that path, and it actually discourages them. It kind of puts things into a perspective where they can actually avoid some of those pitfalls. So, for the kids reading this story within the classroom, I think it would be a very powerful incentive for them to see the other side, because unfortunately, the way things are set up in high schools, especially, often it's the bad kids, well, not the bad kids, their kids aren't really bad, but it's the kids that have a bad reputation that are glamorized, which is like ridiculous, but that's the way it is. The geeky, good, studious kids are like at the bottom of the tier, and the bad boys are the ones that are glamorized. And this kind of would, I think, address some of that. I personally, I consider wisdom as learning from the mistakes of others without necessarily having had to make those mistakes yourself. And when this is a way for kids to vicariously learn from the mistakes that the main character, whose name is Steve Harmon, he's like a 16-year-old black boy, and he makes these poor choices. And so it's a way for your students to kind of look at the mistakes that he makes, the choices that he makes, and learn from them. um, I think it would be great for you to discuss with the students exactly why Steve makes the choices that he does. Why does he fall in with this group who who end up committing this robbery where this person gets killed? And maybe they could relay some of their own experiences where they've gone along with people that they kind of knew were up to no good, just for the sake of fitting in. And you could, in the course of that discussion, you could also talk about what they would have done the same as Steve and what they would have done differently. And they can also talk about why did the author choose the format of writing it as a screenplay, and whether that was a good choice or not, whether they found the format distracting. Because when I was reading it the first bit, I did find it distracting. Um, Now, the other thing you can really introduce is the whole idea of an unreliable narrator. By the end of the story, and this is, I think, one of the things that makes Monster such a brilliant book. By the end of the story, you're really not that sure how innocent Steve Harmon really is, how much he was really involved in this whole incident. You're really not that sure. I mean, personally, I gave him the benefit of the doubt, and I thought that he really played more of a lookout role. But really, the case could be argued that he's a lot more guilty than he's letting on, and that really introduces the idea of an unreliable narrator. And teenagers are notorious for being unreliable narrators. They will deflect, they will obfuscate, they will do all kinds of things. And I think Steve does a little bit of that in the story as well. And yet he's a very sympathetic character. I found him to be a completely sympathetic character. Uh, okay, and so you could ask the students, like, let them ask themselves, what is he leaving out? What is he leaving out? What is he twisting? What is he trying to justify and trying to paint in the best possible terms? So these are all things that the students could discuss. You could even have a mock trial in the classroom where you have people advocating either for or against Steve Harmon, almost like a debate. I think that would be a really effective use. Also, I think a fantastic idea would be, because it's already written as a screenplay, the students could choose certain scenes of the story that they could actually enact. I mean, that would add a dramatic element to the class, to the course on it. I mean, it would be fantastic. Um, let's see. And at the when the prosecutor calls him a monster, I think it would be an excellent idea for the students to discuss why, in the prosecutor's perspective, Steve is a monster. What racial elements are there involved? What prejudices are involved? Because this story is, and the beauty about the book is that it doesn't beat you over the head with the whole racism thing. You get it, you see it from Steve's perspective. I mean, if he was a white kid, there's no way they would be treating him like this. Okay, he would be treated with much more understanding than he is being treated with in the case here. Um, and really, it comes down to ask the students, well, do you think Steve is a monster? Do you think he deserves for the prosecutor to refer to him that way? I mean, really, that's the crux of the book. I mean, it's a fantastic title. It's a really amazing, very powerful title. And also, you can extrapolate the discussion into, how does society look at young black males? It's really interesting because when they're babies, how does society perceive little black boys, and when they're toddlers, and then when they're teenagers, how do things change, and whether that's fair, whether it's prejudice. Remember, prejudice is prejudging someone. And also, there's a number of poignant scenes in the book where Steve is dealing with his family. And you can see the agony that his parents are going through. And there could be a discussion on how Steve's actions are impacting the family, and even how they're impacting his siblings. I think he has some siblings. I'm not sure. I can't remember. Or maybe I'm confusing it with Lockdown, the other book. There's another book right after this that Walter Dean Myers wrote. It's called Lockdown, and it kind of goes over some of the same material as Monster, only it goes after he's already incarcerated. This kid is already incarcerated. And it would be a really good idea to use Lockdown as well as Monster. Although honestly, after I finished reading Monster, it kind of spoiled me for a Lockdown because I want other books by the same author to be just as good but completely different. And Lockdown to me, it covered some of the same material a bit too much, so I was a little bit disappointed with Lockdown. But mind you, I think a lot of the students would probably find it fascinating because it actually goes into a bit more further depth into it. So you could actually contrast Monster with Lockdown, and the what happens, the whole scenario within Lockdown, where this boy who has been found guilty and he is serving his sentence, he has to deal with the other kids in jail in this facility, and he has to deal with the way they're jockeying for position and the way they threaten each other with violence. Okay, and there's a very powerful scene in Lockdown where the main character is trying to decide whether or not he should stand up to another inmate. And it will involve violence, because that's the way they more communicate within the prison. A lot of the juveniles, they it's violence. It's like it's almost like a jungle in there. And so he has to decide whether he's going to do this, even though it will set him back in terms of privileges and might even mean that he stays longer in prison. Now, and finally, when they finish the book, they can discuss what will happen to Steve after the trial and what are his prospects for the future. Because a lot of the time the teens don't realize that this is going to affect the rest of your life. It's going to affect the rest of your life. Now, Steve's still young, so it's possible that it could be expunged on his record, but a lot of the students and a lot of the kids in this situation, they become kind of tainted and kind of targets from the police after this, and pretty soon they start out in juvenile and then they'll end up in adult prison. There's a really good show on television as well. It's called Beyond Scared Straight. And it would be a very good idea to pair maybe watching one or two episodes of that and contrasting it with Monster in terms of how accurate the book is, how it reflects the realities that teenagers are going through. I hope you found this tutorial useful, and I hope you'll check out my other tutorials. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to really focus on practical ways of using the books in the classroom. I mean, Monster, look at the awards on the front cover. It deserved every single award it got. I mean, it was up for the print. It got the Prince Award, the Curtis Scott King Award, and it also was a National Book Award finalist. And it deserved all three of them. It really blew me away. Thank you for listening.